The dagger came out of the dark before anyone could shout a warning. Elira felt the rush of air pass her cheek a heartbeat before she heard the crack of metal striking stone behind her. She dropped the basket of linens she was carrying and pressed herself against the cold wall of the east corridor, her heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her throat. Somewhere ahead, in the shadows near the kitchen archway, a figure in a dark cloak turned and ran. She did not think. She screamed for the guards. Within seconds, boots pounded against the stone floor, torches flared to life, and the quiet night that had settled over the Silverfang Palace shattered into chaos. Elira stood frozen, her back against the wall, staring at the blade now lodged in the wood of the doorframe, only inches from where her head had been a moment earlier. Her hands trembled as she reached out and touched the hilt, not quite believing it was real. "Do not move." The voice was low, commanding, and instantly recognizable. King Alaric Voss appeared from the direction of the private stairwell, still dressed in the simple tunic he wore at night, his sword already drawn. His golden eyes, sharp as any hawk's, swept the corridor before landing on her. For a moment, something flickered across his face, something that looked almost like fear, though kings were not supposed to fear anything. "Are you hurt?" he asked, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. "No," Elira managed, though her voice came out thinner than she intended. "No, I am fine. It missed me." Alaric's jaw tightened as he looked at the dagger still buried in the doorframe. He reached past her and pulled it free, turning it over in his hand. The blade was plain, unmarked, the kind that could belong to a soldier, a servant, or a spy. There was nothing about it that gave away who had thrown it, and that, more than anything, made the king's expression darken. "Someone was in the palace," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "Someone who should not have been able to get this close." Guards flooded the corridor, fanning out toward the kitchens, the servants' stairs, and the outer courtyard. Elira watched them go, still shaking, while Alaric stayed exactly where he was, standing between her and the open hallway, as though his own body were a wall no blade could pass through. "You should not be standing guard over a maid, Your Majesty," she whispered. "Your guards will handle it." "You almost died in my hallway tonight," Alaric said, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "I am not leaving until I know you are safe." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The torches crackled along the walls, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked at the commotion. Elira lowered her eyes, unsure what to do with the way he was looking at her, as though the missing intruder mattered less to him than the fact that she was still breathing. It was Captain Garrett who finally broke the silence, jogging back down the corridor with his sword sheathed, and his expression grim. "He is gone, Your Majesty," Garrett reported. "Slipped out through the old stable gate. We found footprints, nothing more." Whoever it was knew this palace well enough to disappear in under a minute. Alaric's eyes narrowed. That means it was not a random thief. "No, my king," Garrett agreed. "It was not." The words hung heavy in the corridor. Elira felt a chill crawl up her spine that had nothing to do with the late hour. Someone inside the walls of the palace, someone who understood its secret passages and hidden exits, had thrown a blade meant to kill. And it had almost struck her. A maid who owned nothing, who threatened no one, who had never in her life stood between a king and his throne. Unless, she realized with a slow and terrible understanding, the blade had never been meant for her at all. She looked up at Alaric, and from the tightness in his face, she could tell the same thought had already crossed his mind. 3 days earlier, the announcement had gone out across every kingdom bound to Silverfang by treaty, trade, or blood. King Alaric Voss, last of his line, alpha of the great northern pack and ruler of a kingdom that stretched from the Silver Coast to the mountain passes, would choose a queen. 100 princesses had been invited to the palace for a grand ball, a celebration that would stretch across many nights of feasting, dancing, and tests of grace, until at last, the king selected the woman who would rule beside him. It should have been the happiest season of his reign. Instead, Alaric found himself staring out over the training yard each morning, with the weight of the entire kingdom pressing down on his shoulders, wishing more than anything that the whole affair would simply disappear. He did not want a queen chosen from a list of names and titles. He wanted a queen who understood him, who did not flinch at his temper or flatter his pride, who saw the man beneath the crown rather than the crown itself, And though he would never have admitted it to his council, he already knew such a woman existed within his own walls. Illyra had come to the palace 2 years earlier, a quiet young woman from a village near the eastern hills, seeking work after her family's small farm was lost to a poor harvest. She started in the laundry rooms, then moved to the kitchens, and eventually to the upper halls, where her calm manner and careful hands earned her a place among the head housekeeper's most trusted staff. She was not loud, she did not seek attention, but there was something steady in her, an honesty that Alaric had rarely encountered among the nobles who filled his court. He remembered the first time he truly noticed her. It had been a stormy evening, and a tray of dishes had crashed to the floor outside the council chamber. While other servants scrambled and apologized in a panic, Illyra had simply knelt down, gathered the broken pieces without complaint, and calmly reassured the frightened young servant responsible for the accident. Alaric, watching from the doorway, had felt something shift inside him that he did not fully understand until much later. Since then, their paths crossed more often than either of them would call accidental. A late night in the library when neither could sleep. A quiet exchange in the garden when the weight of ruling grew too heavy for him to carry alone. Illyra never asked him for favors, never tried to use their conversations to elevate her position. And that, more than her gentle voice or her patient eyes, was what made Alaric trust her above every noble in his court. But trust was a dangerous thing for a king to give a servant, especially now, with 100 princesses arriving, to compete for his hand and an assassin loose somewhere within his own walls. The morning after the attack, the palace buzzed with rumors. Servants whispered in the kitchens about a masked figure seen near the stables. Guards doubled their patrols along the outer walls. Council members arrived for an emergency meeting, their faces tight with concern, though none of them yet knew whether the attempted attack was aimed at the king, at the upcoming ball, or at something else entirely. Alaric sat at the head of the long council table, his fingers drumming against the polished wood, as Lord Fenwick, his eldest advisor, laid out what little they knew. The blade was common, untraceable, Fenwick said. No markings, no crest, nothing to identify its owner. Whoever threw it either wanted no connection back to themselves, or simply had no allegiance to declare. A hired hand, Garrett added from where he stood near the door. Someone paid to make an attempt and vanish, not someone acting out of personal grievance. Which means someone with resources wanted this done, Alaric said grimly. Someone who can afford to hire a killer capable of slipping into my palace unnoticed. The room fell silent. Everyone understood what that implied. With 100 princesses arriving from kingdoms near and far, any number of political rivals could benefit from chaos at Silverfang, from doubt cast over the king's ability to protect his own halls, or worse, from the king's death entirely, leaving the throne vulnerable during a season already filled with uncertainty. Should we cancel the ball? Fenwick asked carefully. No. Alaric's answer came without hesitation. If someone wants to use fear to control what happens in this kingdom, the last thing I will give them is the satisfaction of seeing me retreat. The ball continues as planned. But I want the palace searched, every hidden passage checked, every guard doubled, and I want to know who was near the east corridor last night. Garrett nodded and moved to leave, but Alaric raised a hand to stop him. And Garrett, he added, his voice quieter now, I want a guard placed near the housekeeper's wing. Discreetly. Garrett's eyes flicked toward the king, understanding passing silently between them, before he nodded once and left the room. Illyra spent the following days trying to convince herself that nothing had changed, though everything about the palace felt different now. Guards stood in places they had never stood before. Doors that used to remain open through the night were locked and barred, and whenever she passed through the halls, she found herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting a shadow to detach itself from the darkness. She told herself the dagger had been meant for someone else, a passing thief startled by her presence, an accident of timing, and nothing more. It was easier to believe that than to imagine any world in which someone had targeted her on purpose. She was no one of importance. She scrubbed floors and mended linens. She had no enemies, no inheritance, no political weight to threaten anyone. And yet the memory of the king's face in that corridor, the raw fear in his eyes as he asked if she was hurt, told her a different story. Kings did not look at servants that way. Kings did not stand guard over maids in the middle of the night, sword drawn, refusing to leave, until they were certain of safety. She was still turning the thought over in her mind 3 days later, when the head housekeeper, a stern but fair woman named Odalise, called her into the linen room. "You have been reassigned," Odalise said without preamble, sorting through a stack of folded cloth. "Effective today, you will assist in preparing the private quarters used by the king's personal guests. Captain Garrett requested you specifically." Elira blinked. "Me? Why would the captain request me?" Odalise shrugged, though there was something knowing in the set of her mouth. "I did not ask. When the captain of the guard makes a request, I do not question it. Report to the West Tower within the hour." Elira left the linen room with more questions than answers, her stomach tight with a mixture of confusion and something else she did not want to name. The West Tower held the private guest chambers, rooms reserved for visiting dignitaries and, during the current season, for the highest-ranking princesses competing for the king's hand. It was the last place she expected to be assigned, and the timing, so soon after the attack, felt far from coincidental. She found out the truth that evening, when Garrett intercepted her in the tower stairwell, his expression apologetic beneath its usual stoicism. "I asked for you to be moved," he admitted, keeping his voice low. "The East Wing is too exposed right now, and the West Tower has guards posted at every entrance. It was the safest place I could put you without drawing attention to why." "The king asked you to do this," Elira said. It was not a question. Garrett hesitated, then nodded once. He did not order it directly. He simply mentioned, more than once, that he did not like the idea of you working in an unguarded wing, while whoever attacked the corridor remained free. I understood what he meant without him having to say it plainly. Elira felt heat rise in her cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or something warmer, she could not say. He should not be spending his attention on me, not with 100 princesses arriving and a killer loose in his palace. "Perhaps," Garrett said, a faint and knowing smile touching his mouth, "but try telling him that." He left her standing alone in the stairwell, the torches casting long shadows across the stone steps, and for the first time since the dagger had struck the doorframe beside her head, Elira allowed herself to wonder what it might mean that the King of Silverfang, faced with the greatest political decision of his reign, could not stop thinking about a maid. The first of the princesses arrived 2 days later, and the palace transformed almost overnight. Banners in 100 different colors lined the great hall. Carriages bearing crests from distant kingdoms rolled through the front gates in an endless procession, each one more extravagant than the last. Servants rushed to prepare chambers, kitchens filled with the smell of roasting meat and fresh bread, and musicians tuned their instruments in preparation for the first of many nights of celebration. Elira watched the spectacle from the high windows of the West Tower, her arms full of freshly pressed linens, and felt a strange hollow ache settle in her chest. Princess after princess stepped down from her carriage in gowns of silk and jewels that likely cost more than Elira would earn in a lifetime. They laughed and preened for the watching crowd, already competing for attention before the ball had even begun. She told herself it did not matter to her who the king chose. She was a maid, he was a king. The distance between their worlds was as vast as the ocean that separated Silverfang from the southern kingdoms, and nothing that had passed between them in quiet hallways and late-night libraries could ever change that simple, immovable fact. And yet, standing at the window, watching Alaric greet each arriving princess with the same practiced, polite smile, she could not stop the small twist of something painful in her chest whenever he took a woman's hand and bowed. "You are staring," came a voice from behind her. Elira turned to find Odalise standing in the doorway, arms crossed, though her expression held more amusement than reprimand. "I am simply watching the arrivals," Elira said quickly, setting the linens down on the nearby table. "It is quite the spectacle." Odalise said, unconvinced. "A spectacle indeed. 100 princesses, all vying for a man who has not looked twice at any of them since they stepped through the gates." Elira said nothing, but her cheeks warmed regardless. "Careful, girl," Odalise added, her voice softening. "Hope is a dangerous thing to carry in a palace like this one. Especially now, with knives flying through the corridors at night." The reminder settled over Elira like a cold shadow. She had almost managed to forget, in the chaos of the princess's arrival, that somewhere within these very walls, a killer still walked free, unidentified and unpunished, their true target still unknown. That night, unable to sleep, Elira slipped out onto the small balcony attached to the servants' quarters, seeking the cool night air to calm the restless thoughts crowding her mind. The palace grounds stretched below her, quiet now except for the distant flicker of guard torches along the outer wall. Somewhere out there, among the shadows, whoever had thrown that dagger was likely watching, waiting, planning their next move. She did not hear him approach until his voice broke the silence beside her. "You should not be out here alone." Elira startled, turning to find Alaric standing a few feet away, still dressed in his formal attire from the evening's welcoming feast, though his crown had been discarded somewhere along the way. In the moonlight, without the weight of his title pressing so visibly upon him, he looked younger, more tired, more human than she had ever seen him. "I could say the same to you, Your Majesty," she replied. "Should you not be with your guests?" "I grew tired of pretending to enjoy myself," he admitted, moving to stand beside her at the balcony railing. 100 women smiling at me, each one hoping to become queen, and not a single one of them asking me a question I actually wanted to answer. Elira allowed herself a small smile. "That does sound exhausting." "It is." He glanced at her sideways. "You are the only person in this entire palace who has not once tried to flatter me since this whole affair began. Would you prefer that I did?" "No," he said, so quickly and firmly that it surprised them both. "No, I would not." The silence between them stretched, comfortable despite the tension simmering beneath it. Below them, a guard's torch flickered along the garden path, a reminder of the danger still lurking somewhere in the shadows. "Have they found anything more?" Elira asked quietly. "About the attack?" Alaric's expression darkened. "Nothing yet. Whoever it was has not moved again, which worries me more than if they had. It means they are waiting for the right moment." "The ball," Elira guessed. "Likely," he confirmed. 100 princesses, dozens of foreign guards, endless movement through the halls. It would be the easiest time to strike without being noticed. Elira wrapped her arms around herself against the chill of the night, though the cold she felt had little to do with the weather. "Then you must be even more careful, Your Majesty." "Alaric," he corrected softly. "When it is just the two of us, you may call me Alaric." She looked up at him, startled by the quiet intimacy in his request, and found him watching her with an expression she could not quite name, something between hope and hesitation, as though he were afraid that speaking the wrong words might shatter whatever fragile thing existed between them. "Alaric," she repeated softly, testing the shape of his name without the title attached to it. Something in his face eased at the sound of it, and for a moment, standing together on that quiet balcony, beneath a sky full of stars, the danger stalking the palace halls, and the 100 princesses waiting inside, felt very far away. But far away was not the same as gone, and neither of them could ignore the truth settling heavier with each passing night. Somewhere in the shadows of Silverfang, a hidden enemy was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again, and this time, Elira feared, they might not miss. The scream came from the kitchen wing, just after midnight, sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet like a blade through silk. Elira dropped the tray she was carrying, and ran toward the sound, her bare feet slapping against the cold stone floor. She found a young serving girl named Maid pressed against the pantry wall, shaking, pointing a trembling finger toward the open window above the wash basin. "Someone was there," Maid gasped. "A man, at the window, watching. He ran the moment I screamed." Guards arrived within moments, spilling into the kitchen with swords drawn, but by the time they reached the window and scanned the darkened courtyard beyond, whoever had been watching was already gone, swallowed by the night as completely as the first intruder had been days earlier. Elira wrapped a comforting arm around Maid's shoulders, though her own heart was pounding just as hard. 2 incidents in less than a week, both involving the servants' wing, both leaving no trace behind except fear. She thought of the dagger still resting in a locked drawer in Captain Garrett's office, unmarked and unclaimed, and wondered again whether these strange, silent threats were truly random, or whether someone was circling closer to a target they had not yet managed to reach. By morning, the entire palace staff had heard the story, whispered version after whispered version growing more dramatic with each retelling, until the truth of a frightened girl and an unknown figure at a window transformed into tales of masked killers stalking the halls in search of royal blood. Elira said little when others asked her about it, though privately she found herself glancing toward every shadowed corner, every unlit corridor, with a wariness she had never carried before. The grand ball began that evening despite the unease hanging over the palace, because a king could not show weakness before 100 visiting kingdoms, and Alaric was determined not to let fear dictate his reign. The great hall had been transformed into something out of a dream, its high ceilings strung with silver lanterns, its marble floors polished to a mirror shine beneath the glow of 1,000 candles. Musicians filled the air with sweeping melodies, and the scent of roses drifted from enormous floral arrangements lining every wall. The princesses entered one by one, announced by name and kingdom, each descending the grand staircase in gowns crafted to dazzle. There was Princess Odette of the Coral Isles, draped in shimmering blue silk that seemed to move like water with every step. There was Princess Leora of the Amber Hills, crowned in gold and confidence, her sharp eyes already sweeping the room for advantage. And there was Princess Seraphine of the Ember Court, dressed in deep crimson, her dark hair swept into an elegant braid, moving through the crowd with the practiced grace of someone who had spent her entire life being watched, and had long ago decided to enjoy it. Seraphine was, by most accounts, the leading favorite among the assembled royals. Her kingdom held significant trade influence along the eastern rivers, her wit was sharp enough to hold her own in any conversation, and her beauty was undeniable even among 99 other princesses competing for the same prize. She had arrived at Silverfang fully expecting to leave as its future queen, and nothing about the evening so far had given her reason to doubt that outcome. Until she noticed where the king's attention kept drifting. It happened first during the opening dance, when Alaric moved through the customary rotation of partners required by tradition, offering each princess a single dance to demonstrate equal favor before the evening's festivities properly began. Seraphine watched him carefully as he danced, noting the polite smile that never quite reached his eyes, the practiced conversation that carried no real warmth behind it. He was performing a role, she realized, going through motions expected of him, rather than genuinely engaging with any woman before him. But then, near the edge of the hall, where servants moved quietly along the walls refilling goblets and clearing empty plates, she saw his gaze shift, just for a moment, just long enough to be noticeable to someone as observant as herself. A young woman in a simple gray dress, her dark hair pulled back in a plain braid, moved among the tables with quiet efficiency, and the king's eyes followed her with an intensity he had shown to none of the 100 princesses gathered specifically to win his favor. Seraphine filed the observation away, with the same careful precision she applied to every piece of political information that crossed her path. It might mean nothing. Kings were, after all, only men, prone to distraction like anyone else. But if it meant something more, if the rumors already circulating quietly among the visiting delegations held any truth, then understanding the nature of that distraction could prove valuable before the competition concluded. Alira felt the weight of being watched long before she identified its source. She kept her eyes low as she moved through the crowded hall, focused entirely on her duties, refilling goblets and clearing plates with the careful, practiced movements Odalus had drilled into every member of the household staff. She had learned long ago that servants who drew attention rarely fared well in noble houses, and tonight, surrounded by 100 princesses and their attending courts, drawing attention seemed particularly unwise. But when she finally allowed herself a brief glance toward the dance floor, she found Alaric's eyes already on her, holding her gaze across the crowded room for one long, suspended moment before duty forced him to turn back to his current dance partner. Heat rushed to her cheeks, and she quickly busied herself with an empty tray, praying no one else had noticed the exchange. Someone had. "You are the maid from the corridor," came a smooth, cultured voice beside her. Elira turned to find Princess Seraphine standing close enough that the scent of her expensive rose perfume filled the air between them, her dark eyes assessing Elira with the kind of sharp attention usually reserved for potential rivals rather than palace staff. "I am sorry, Your Highness," Elira said carefully, dipping into a proper curtsy. "I do not believe we have met." "We have not," Seraphine agreed, a faint smile curving her lips, though it did not reach her eyes. "But I have heard your name mentioned, quietly, among the guards. Elira, is it? The one who was nearly struck by a blade meant for someone else." Elira's stomach tightened. "It was likely a random incident, Your Highness, nothing more." "Perhaps," Seraphine said, tilting her head slightly. studying Alira's face with an intensity that made the maid want to shrink back into the crowd. Though I find it curious how carefully the king watches a random incident survivor. Before Alira could formulate a response, Seraphine had already turned away, gliding back toward the dance floor, with the same effortless grace she carried into every room, leaving Alira standing frozen, with an empty tray clutched tightly in her hands, and a cold dread settling into her stomach. If a princess she had never met could already sense the truth simmering beneath the surface, how long would it be before the rest of the court noticed as well? And more dangerously, how long before whoever had thrown that dagger through the corridor understood exactly what, or who, mattered most to the king of Silverfang? The ball continued long into the night, and Alaric endured it with the patient discipline expected of any ruler, dancing with princess after princess, engaging in conversations about trade agreements and border treaties, and the weather in kingdoms he had never visited and had little interest in ever seeing. Each conversation blurred into the next, a parade of pleasant faces and practiced compliments that left him feeling more exhausted with every passing hour. It was only during a brief pause, when he stepped out onto the side terrace for a moment of fresh air away from the crowded hall, that he allowed himself to drop the polished mask he had worn all evening. The night air was cool against his skin, carrying the faint scent of roses from the gardens below, and for a moment, he simply stood at the railing, breathing deeply, grateful for the silence. "Tired already, Your Majesty?" Garrett's voice came from the shadows near the terrace door, where the captain had positioned himself as an unofficial guard against interruption. "The night has barely begun. I have danced with 43 princesses in the last 2 hours," Alaric said dryly. "I believe I have earned a moment of peace." Garrett chuckled quietly, then his expression sobered. "Any word on the incident in the kitchen wing?" "None," Alaric admitted, his jaw tightening. "Whoever it was, vanished before the guards arrived, same as the corridor. 2 incidents, both near the servants' quarters, both leaving no trace." "You think they are connected to the maid," Garrett said. It was not a question. Alaric was silent for a long moment, staring out over the moonlit gardens. "I do not know what to think, but I know I do not like the pattern forming. If someone wishes to use her to reach me, or to punish me for a distraction they believe should not exist, then every moment she remains unprotected is a risk I am not willing to accept." "The West Tower guards have been doubled, as you requested," Garrett assured him. "She is as safe as I can make her within these walls." "It is not enough," Alaric said quietly. "Not until we know who is behind this." Before Garrett could respond, the terrace door opened once more, and Princess Seraphine stepped out into the cool night air, her crimson gown catching the moonlight as she moved. She paused when she saw the 2 men, offering a graceful bow of her head. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Majesty," she said smoothly. "I simply wished for a moment away from the crowd, same as you, it seems." "Of course, Princess," Alaric replied, straightening into the practiced posture expected of him. "The terrace is large enough for us both." Seraphine moved to stand a respectful distance away, her eyes drifting over the gardens below before sliding back toward the king with careful precision. "I could not help but notice, earlier this evening, how attentive you seemed toward one of your household staff. The young woman from the corridor incident, I believe." Alaric's expression remained carefully neutral, though Garrett shifted almost imperceptibly beside him, a silent readiness settling over the captain's posture. "I make it a habit to ensure the safety of everyone within my walls, princess, servant, and noble alike." "Of course," Seraphine said, her smile widening just slightly, as though she recognized the deflection for exactly what it was, and found it more amusing than convincing. "A commendable trait in a king. I only mention it because rumors travel quickly among 100 competing princesses, Your Majesty, and rumors, once started, are rarely kind to their subjects, particularly subjects who possess so little power to defend themselves against them." The warning, delivered with perfect courtly politeness, settled heavily in the night air between them. Alaric held Seraphine's gaze, understanding exactly what she was telling him, and exactly what she was not yet threatening, though the possibility hung unspoken between every carefully chosen word. "I appreciate your concern, Princess," he said finally, his voice cool and even. "Rest assured, I am well aware of how quickly rumors spread within these walls." Seraphine inclined her head once more, satisfied, it seemed, with having made her point without needing to press further. "Then I shall leave you to your peace, Your Majesty. I look forward to our dance, whenever you find the time." She disappeared back into the ballroom, leaving Alaric standing at the railing with a fresh weight settling over his shoulders, heavier than exhaustion, heavier than the endless parade of princesses waiting inside. If Seraphine had already noticed the truth simmering beneath his careful composure, it would not be long before others did as well, and in a palace already threatened by an unknown enemy, that kind of visibility could prove dangerous for the one person he most wanted to protect. Alira did not learn of the conversation on the terrace until much later, when Odalise pulled her aside in the quiet hours after the ball finally ended, her expression grave. "Word is spreading, girl," Odalise said without preamble, checking to ensure they were alone before continuing. "One of the visiting princesses noticed the king's attention toward you tonight, Princess Seraphine. If the whispers are accurate." Alira's stomach dropped. "She spoke to me directly, during the ball. She seemed to already suspect something." "Then you understand the danger you are now standing in," Odalise said, her voice softening with genuine concern. "A palace full of ambitious princesses and their courts is not a forgiving place for a servant suspected of catching a king's eye. Whatever exists between you and His Majesty, whatever it might become, you must understand that it will not be received kindly by those who came here expecting a crown for themselves." "I have done nothing to encourage it," Alira said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were not entirely true. She had not sought Alaric's attention, had never once asked for his favor or his protection, but neither had she turned away from the quiet moments they shared, the late-night conversations, the shared silences that had grown more comfortable with each passing week. "Intention matters little in a palace like this one," Odalise said gently. "Perception is everything, and right now, girl, the perception forming around you is one that could put you in far greater danger than a dagger thrown in a dark corridor." The warning settled over Alira like a heavy cloak as she made her way back to the West Tower long after midnight, the sounds of the ball's final revelers fading behind her. She thought of the dagger, of the figure at the kitchen window, of Seraphine's sharp, knowing eyes, and wondered, not for the first time, whether the quiet affection growing between herself and the king was worth the danger it seemed determined to bring, crashing down upon them both. But when she reached the tower stairwell and found Alaric waiting there, having clearly slipped away from the last of the evening's obligations, specifically to ensure she had returned safely, the warmth that filled her chest at the sight of him made it difficult to regret anything at all. "You should be resting," she said softly, though she made no move to send him away. "So should you," he replied, falling into step beside her as she climbed the tower stairs. "Though I find I sleep poorly when I do not know you are safe." Neither of them spoke of Seraphine's warning, or the growing danger stalking the palace halls, or the 100 princesses waiting below, who would gladly see this quiet, forbidden connection destroyed before it could ever fully bloom. For now, in the dim torchlight of the tower stairwell, it was enough simply to walk beside each other, two people caught between duty and desire, unaware of how quickly the danger surrounding them was about to close in. Glass shattered somewhere above the ballroom, and for one frozen second, the entire hall fell silent. Then chaos erupted. Guests screamed and scrambled away from the tall windows lining the eastern wall, as a heavy shard of colored glass crashed down onto the marble floor, narrowly missing a cluster of startled nobles. Guards rushed toward the source, swords drawn, while musicians stumbled to a halt mid-song, and princesses clutched at their gowns in alarm. Alaric was moving before he had time to think, cutting through the panicked crowd with Garrett close behind him, both men scanning the shadows of the upper gallery, where the window had been struck. By the time they reached the stairwell leading up to the gallery, whoever had thrown the object responsible for the shattered glass, a heavy iron weight wrapped in cloth, had already disappeared through a service corridor rarely used by anyone outside the household staff. "Third incident in a week," Garrett muttered grimly, kneeling to examine the iron weight left behind. And this one happened in full view of half the visiting kingdoms. Alaric's expression was carved from stone as he surveyed the damage below, the startled princesses being calmed by their attendants, the nervous murmur rippling through the crowd like wind through dry grass. "They are growing bolder, testing how far they can push before someone stops them." "Or sending a message," Garrett said quietly. Alaric did not need to ask what kind of message. 3 attacks in a week, each one more visible than the last, each one carefully timed to cause maximum disruption without ever revealing the identity of the person responsible. It was not the work of a random criminal seeking opportunity. It was calculated, deliberate, and increasingly dangerous. Elira heard about the shattered window from the frightened whispers of two younger servants huddled together in the linen room, their hands still trembling as they described the chaos that had erupted in the ballroom only an hour earlier. She listened with a growing sense of dread, the same cold unease that had settled into her stomach since the night the dagger struck the doorframe beside her head. "They say the king searched the entire gallery himself," one of the girls whispered. "Found nothing but an iron weight and an open window. Whoever it was simply vanished." "Do you think it is the same person from before?" the other asked. "The one from the corridor and the kitchen window?" "Who else could it be?" the first girl replied. "Someone who knows this palace better than the guards who are supposed to protect it." Elira excused herself quietly, her mind racing as she made her way toward the West Tower, where Odalise had assigned her extra duties, preparing chambers for the following day's festivities. The pattern the servants described troubled her deeply. Each attack seemed designed not to cause serious harm, but to create fear, to demonstrate that whoever was responsible could move through the palace at will, striking wherever and whenever they chose, without ever being caught. It was the kind of pattern, she realized with a chill, that suggested patience, someone willing to wait, to test, to build toward something larger before finally revealing their true purpose. She was so lost in thought that she nearly collided with Princess Seraphine as she rounded the corner into the tower stairwell. "Careful," Seraphine said, steadying herself with a hand against the wall, her sharp eyes immediately assessing Elira from head to toe. "You seem distracted, girl." "Forgive me, Your Highness," Elira said quickly, dropping into a curtsy. "I did not see you there." Understandable, given the excitement downstairs. Seraphine's tone carried a careful lightness that did not quite mask the calculation beneath it. "Tell me, have you heard anything useful about our mysterious intruder? Servants tend to know far more about a palace's secrets than the nobles who live within its walls." Elira chose her words carefully, aware of how easily anything she said could be twisted or repeated, to serve purposes she did not fully understand. "I know only what everyone else knows, Your Highness, that someone has attacked the palace 3 times now, and that no one has yet discovered who is responsible." Seraphine studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "How curious that all 3 incidents have occurred so close to areas you yourself frequent, the corridor near your quarters, the kitchen window during your shift, and now a gallery directly above the section of the ballroom where you were stationed this evening." The observation hit Elira like a physical blow. She had not consciously noticed the pattern before, too consumed by fear and confusion to step back and examine the larger picture, but hearing it laid out so plainly by someone as perceptive as Seraphine made the coincidence impossible to ignore. "I do not know what you are suggesting, Your Highness," Elira said carefully, though her voice betrayed the unease coiling tighter in her chest. "I am not suggesting anything," Seraphine replied smoothly. "I am simply observing a pattern that I suspect the king himself has already noticed, given how closely his guards have been watching over you since the first attack." She paused, studying Elira with something that might have been genuine curiosity beneath her calculating exterior. "Whatever is happening within these walls, girl, you would do well to consider whether you are truly safe here, or whether your continued presence is placing you, and perhaps others, in far greater danger than any of you yet realize." With that, Seraphine swept past her and disappeared down the corridor, leaving Elira standing alone in the stairwell, with a fear settling deep into her bones that had nothing to do with rumors or gossip, and everything to do with a truth she could no longer deny. Someone was targeting her specifically, and she had no idea why. That night, Alaric summoned Garrett and Fenwick to a private meeting in his chambers, far from the prying ears of the court, and the visiting delegations still buzzing with speculation about the evening's chaos. A single candle burned on the table between them, casting long shadows across the stone walls, as the 3 men studied a rough map of the palace grounds spread out before them. "Mark every location," Alaric instructed, "every incident, exactly where it occurred." Garrett leaned forward, placing small carved markers at 3 points on the map: the east corridor near the servants' quarters, the kitchen window facing the courtyard, and the gallery above the ballroom's eastern section. When he stepped back, the pattern was impossible to ignore. "They form a rough line," Fenwick observed, tracing the path between the 3 markers with his finger. almost as though someone is charting a route through the palace, rather than choosing targets at random. Or following someone, Alaric said grimly, whose movements happened to pass through all three locations. The room fell silent as the implications settled over them. Illyra worked throughout the palace in her various duties, moving between the servants' quarters, the kitchens, and increasingly, the upper halls where the ball's festivities took place. Her daily path traced almost exactly the pattern now marked upon the map. "You believe she is being followed," Garrett said quietly. "Hunted." "I believe," Alaric said, his voice tight with barely restrained anger, "that someone has decided the fastest way to weaken me, or to punish me for whatever affection they believe I hold for a servant beneath my station, is to threaten the one person whose safety matters to me more than my own." "Then we must move her," Fenwick said immediately. "Somewhere secure, somewhere unconnected to her usual duties. If whoever is responsible is tracking her movements through the palace, breaking that pattern may be the only way to protect her." Alaric considered this for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the small markers scattered across the map, like warning signs he had been too slow to recognize. "Move her to the royal wing," he said finally, "under guard, day and night. I do not care what explanation we give the court. Her safety is no longer negotiable." Garrett hesitated. "Your Majesty, moving a servant into the royal wing during the height of the ball season will draw exactly the kind of attention we have been trying to avoid. The princesses already suspect." "I am aware of what the princesses suspect," Alaric cut in sharply. "I am also aware that if something happens to her because I prioritized appearances over her safety, I will never forgive myself for the rest of my life." He softened slightly, running a tired hand through his hair. "Find a way, Garrett, please." Garrett exchanged a glance with Fenwick, then nodded slowly. "I will find a way, Your Majesty." Illyra received the news of her reassignment the following morning, with a mixture of gratitude and dread. Odalis delivered the message with careful neutrality, though her eyes carried unspoken concern, as she explained that Illyra would now be housed within the royal wing itself, under direct guard, her duties adjusted to keep her within sight of the palace's most heavily protected halls at all times. "This will not go unnoticed," Odalis warned quietly. "The princesses will ask questions, the court will speculate. Whatever privacy you and the king have managed to preserve until now, girl, it ends the moment you cross into that wing." "I understand," Illyra said, though the weight of the warning settled heavily in her chest. She thought of Seraphine's sharp, calculating eyes, of the whispers already spreading through the palace, and wondered how much worse those whispers would become once her new living quarters became common knowledge. But when she thought of the dagger, the shattered glass, the pattern traced so carefully across the palace map that Garrett had shown her before the reassignment, she understood that whatever danger came from wagging tongues and jealous princesses paled in comparison to the danger of remaining an easy, predictable target for whoever was stalking the halls with increasingly bold intentions. She moved her few belongings into a small chamber within the royal wing that evening, guarded by two stone-faced soldiers who took up position outside her door, without a word of explanation to the curious servants who passed by. She had barely finished settling in when a soft knock sounded at her door. Alaric stood in the hallway when she opened it, his expression a careful mixture of relief and lingering worry. "You are safe now," he said, though the statement carried the weight of a promise as much as an observation. "For how long?" Illyra asked quietly. "Whoever has been doing this has not been caught. Moving me to a new wing does not change that." "No," Alaric admitted, "but it makes you harder to reach, and it gives Garrett time to investigate without you serving as a constant, predictable target." Illyra stepped aside to let him enter, though the presence of guards just beyond the door reminded her sharply of how far removed this moment was from the quiet, stolen conversations they had once shared in hallways and gardens, unwatched and unremarked upon. "Everyone will know now," she said softly, "about us, about whatever this is." Alaric's expression grew serious as he studied her face in the dim candlelight. "Does that frighten you?" "It should," she admitted. "A king cannot simply choose a maid over 100 princesses without consequence. The court will not accept it easily. Your council will not accept it easily." "I am aware of the consequences," Alaric said quietly, closing the distance between them until only a small space remained. "I have spent every night since the ball began weighing them, turning them over in my mind, searching for a version of this story, where choosing you does not cost either of us something precious. He paused, his golden eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. I have not found one. But I have also realized that I no longer care. The words hung between them, heavy with a truth neither of them had yet spoken aloud, though it had been building steadily since the first night he found her in a storm-damaged hallway, calmly gathering broken dishes without complaint. Illyra felt her heart pounding, torn between the fear of what such a confession might cost them both, and the undeniable warmth blooming in her chest at finally hearing him say it. Alaric, she whispered, uncertain what words could possibly follow his name. But before either of them could say anything more, a sharp cry rang out from somewhere down the corridor, followed by the unmistakable sound of steel clashing against steel, and the fragile moment between them shattered, as completely as the glass that had fallen from the ballroom gallery only a day before. Alaric was through the door and into the corridor before Illyra could even call out his name, his sword drawn from the sheath he now carried everywhere within the palace walls. She followed close behind, ignoring the guards who moved to block her path, and skidded to a stop at the sight before her. One of the royal wing guards lay against the wall, clutching a bleeding wound along his forearm, while a second guard grappled with a cloaked figure near the corridor's far window. The intruder moved with practiced skill, twisting free of the guard's grasp and driving an elbow hard into his ribs before turning to flee toward the open window at the corridor's end. Stop him, Garrett's voice thundered from the stairwell as he arrived at a full run, but the intruder had already reached the window, swinging one leg over the frame with the ease of someone who had planned this exact escape route in advance. Alaric closed the distance in seconds, but the figure dropped from the window before the king could reach him, vanishing into the darkness of the outer gardens below. By the time guards reached the courtyard, fanning out with torches and drawn weapons, there was no trace of the intruder, only a single object left behind on the corridor floor where the struggle had taken place. Garrett knelt and picked it up carefully, turning it over in the torchlight. It was a small signet ring, its surface engraved with a crest neither he nor Alaric immediately recognized, a coiled serpent wrapped around a burning flame. "Do you know this mark?" Alaric asked, taking the ring from Garrett's outstretched hand. "No, Your Majesty," Garrett admitted, "but someone in your council might. It is not a crest common to Silverfang or its immediate allies." Illyra stood frozen near the doorway, watching the guards tend to their wounded companion, her mind racing through the implications of what had just occurred. Whoever had attacked tonight had come directly for the royal wing, directly toward the corridor where she now resided, and had fled only when confronted by armed guards, rather than an unsuspecting maid alone in a hallway. The pattern Garrett had shown her on the map, the careful tracking of her movements through the palace, had just escalated into something far more direct and dangerous. "They came for me," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "Not randomly, not by chance. They knew exactly which room to target." Alaric turned to her, his expression grim with a fury she had never seen him carry before. "Which means, whoever hired this person has access to information only a handful of people within this palace should possess. Your reassignment to the royal wing was not public knowledge beyond a small circle." The realization settled over the corridor like a physical weight. Someone within the palace, someone with access to private council decisions, was feeding information to whoever was orchestrating these attacks. The following days brought a flurry of investigation, though answers remained frustratingly elusive. Fenwick spent hours poring over records of foreign crests and heraldry, searching for any match to the coiled serpent and flame found on the abandoned signet ring, while Garrett questioned every guard, servant, and steward who had known of Illyra's reassignment to the royal wing. Suspicion, inevitably, began to fall upon the visiting princesses and their attending courts, each of whom had motive enough to wish the king's attention redirected away from a servant and back toward the competition they had traveled so far to win. Princess Seraphine, given her earlier confrontations with Illyra and her obvious perceptiveness regarding the situation, found herself the subject of particular scrutiny, though she met the accusations with cool, unbothered composure when Garrett questioned her directly. "I will not pretend I have not noticed the king's attention wandering from the competition," Seraphine said, seated calmly in the drawing room Garrett had commandeered for his interviews. "But I assure you, Captain, hiring assassins is hardly my preferred method of eliminating competition." I find directness far more effective and considerably less likely to result in my own downfall should the attempt fail. You seem remarkably unconcerned for someone under suspicion of conspiracy against the crown, Garrett observed. I am unconcerned because I am innocent, Seraphine replied simply. And because, Captain, if you truly believed I orchestrated these attacks, you would not be sitting across from me asking polite questions. You would already have me in chains. Garrett could not argue with her logic, and reluctantly crossed her name from his list of primary suspects, though he made a note to continue monitoring her movements regardless. The signet ring remained the investigation's most promising lead, and Fenwick finally identified its origin 3 days after the corridor attack, arriving at Alaric's private council chamber with an old, weathered book of heraldry clutched tightly in his hands. The coiled serpent and flame, Fenwick announced, spreading the book open on the table, belongs to House Draven, a minor noble family from the Kingdom of Avalyn. They lost significant standing within their own court decades ago after a failed uprising against Avalyn's ruling family, and have been searching for a path back to relevance ever since. Avalyn sent no princess to the competition, Alaric said, frowning. Why would House Draven concern themselves with Silverfang's affairs? Perhaps they were hired, Garrett suggested. A disgraced family with combat training and nothing left to lose would make an ideal choice for someone wishing to arrange an attack without leaving an obvious trail back to themselves. Then someone paid House Draven to threaten Illyra, Alaric said, his voice hardening with barely restrained anger. Which means we are still no closer to understanding who truly wants her harmed, or why. The council chamber fell silent as the weight of the unanswered question settled over them. Whoever had commissioned these attacks remained hidden, protected by layers of hired hands and disgraced nobles willing to do their bidding for the right price, and until that person was identified, Illyra would remain in danger no matter how many guards surrounded her chambers. Amid the growing tension of the investigation, the ball's traditional ceremonies continued regardless, each night bringing new tests of grace and wit designed to narrow the field of 100 princesses toward a final selection. Alaric endured each ceremony with mounting frustration, performing his role as gracious host, while his thoughts remained fixed on the danger, circling ever closer to the one person he could not bear to lose. The night arrived for the ceremony, meant to narrow the competition to its final 10 candidates, a tradition observed by every generation of Silverfang's rulers before him. The great hall filled once more with all 100 princesses, each dressed in her finest gown, each hoping desperately to hear her name called among the chosen few who would advance toward the final selection. Alaric stood before them on the raised dais, Fenwick beside him holding the ceremonial scroll containing the council's recommendations, though tradition dictated the final choice of which 10 would advance, rested solely with the king himself. He looked out over the assembled princesses, over faces eager with hope and ambition, and felt something inside him finally crack under the accumulated weight of weeks spent pretending an interest he did not feel while the person he actually cared for remained hunted within his own walls. Before we proceed with tonight's ceremony, Alaric said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, I find I must speak honestly, something I fear I have failed to do since this entire competition began. A ripple of surprised murmurs spread through the crowd. Fenwick shot him a warning glance, clearly sensing where this unplanned deviation might be heading, but Alaric pressed forward regardless, unable to stop the words now that they had finally begun to surface. Each of you arrived at Silverfang, believing you had a genuine opportunity to become this kingdom's queen, he continued. And I owe you the honesty of admitting that I have not approached this competition with the sincerity such an opportunity deserves. My attention, my heart, has been elsewhere since long before any of you arrived at my gates, and it would be a disservice to every woman standing before me to continue this pretense any further. The hall erupted into stunned whispers, princesses turning to exchange shocked glances with their attendants, council members shifting uncomfortably along the dais. Somewhere near the edge of the crowd, Seraphine watched the unfolding scene with an expression that carried more understanding than surprise, as though she had anticipated this moment long before it arrived. Your Majesty, Fenwick said quietly, urgently, this is not the appropriate venue for— It is exactly the appropriate venue, Alaric interrupted, his voice firm despite the chaos rippling through the hall. I will not stand before 100 women and their kingdoms, pretending a choice remains undecided when my heart has already made its decision. The words hung in the air, heavy with implications that every person in the room understood without needing further explanation. A king, standing before the greatest gathering of royal courtship in a generation, was refusing to play the game his own kingdom had designed. And somewhere in the shadows beyond the great hall's tall windows, unseen and unheard by anyone celebrating or scandalized by the king's unprecedented declaration, a figure watched the chaos unfold, with cold, calculating satisfaction, already planning how best to use this newfound vulnerability to their own advantage. The council chamber erupted into shouting before the great hall had even finished emptying, voices overlapping in a furious storm of accusation and disbelief. "You have insulted 100 kingdoms in a single evening," Lord Fenwick said, pacing before the long table with barely contained fury. "Trade agreements, military alliances, decades of careful diplomacy, all of it now hanging by a thread because you could not wait until a private audience to declare your heart already spoken for." "I said nothing that was not true," Alaric replied evenly, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed the toll the evening had taken on him. "I owed those women honesty rather than false hope." "You owed this kingdom stability," Fenwick shot back. "Do you understand what you have set in motion tonight? Princess Odette's father has already sent word demanding an explanation. Princess Leora's attendants are packing her belongings as we speak, preparing to leave before dawn in protest. And Seraphine's kingdom controls trade along the eastern rivers that half this court depends upon." "Then let them leave," Alaric said, his voice hardening. "I will not marry a stranger to preserve trade routes while the woman I actually care for remains hunted within my own walls." A heavy silence fell over the chamber. Several council members exchanged uneasy glances, though none dared voice the question clearly weighing on every mind in the room. It was Garrett, standing quietly near the door, who finally gave voice to it. "You have not yet said her name aloud, Your Majesty." "Not officially. Not before the court." Alaric's jaw tightened, but he did not look away. "Elira, the maid who has served this household for 2 years, the woman standing between the throne and my own heart, whether the court accepts it or not." The words landed like a physical blow across the chamber. Several council members sat back in their chairs, stunned into silence, while others began murmuring urgently among themselves, already calculating the political fallout of a king openly declaring intent to elevate a servant above the daughters of 100 allied kingdoms. Fenwick pressed both hands against the table, steadying himself against the weight of what he had just heard confirmed aloud. "Your Majesty, I have served this crown faithfully for 30 years, through your father's reign, and now through yours. I am asking you, as someone who has only ever wanted what is best for this kingdom, to reconsider the path you are walking. A servant cannot become queen without consequences that will echo for generations. The nobility will not accept it. The visiting kingdoms will see it as an insult impossible to forgive. Then perhaps," Alaric said quietly, "it is time this kingdom reconsidered what truly makes someone worthy of a crown." Word of the king's declaration spread through the palace faster than any messenger could have carried it, servant to servant, guest to guest, until by the following morning, every soul within Silverfang's walls understood exactly what had transpired in the great hall the night before. Elira learned of it from Odalise, who arrived at her chamber door pale and shaken, clutching the doorframe as though she needed its support simply to remain standing. "He said your name," Odalise said without preamble, "before the entire court, before every visiting kingdom. He said your name, girl, and told them his heart was already decided." Elira felt the blood drain from her face. "He cannot have. Odalise, tell me you are mistaken." "I wish I were." Odalise stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind her with careful urgency. "The whole palace is in an uproar. Princesses are demanding explanations. Their fathers are sending furious letters. And you, girl, have become the most talked about woman in this entire kingdom overnight, for better or considerably for worse." Elira sank onto the edge of her bed, her hands trembling in her lap. She had known. Somewhere in the quiet corner of her heart she had tried desperately not to examine too closely, that whatever existed between herself and Alaric could not remain hidden forever. But she had imagined, if she had imagined anything at all, a slow unfolding, careful and private, not a sudden, public declaration thrown like a challenge before 100 offended kingdoms. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Odalis's expression softened with genuine sympathy, though the worry etched into her features did not fade. "I do not know, child. I truly do not know. But I fear the danger surrounding you has just grown far larger than a single hired assassin skulking through dark corridors. You have become a target for something far more dangerous now: pride, political humiliation, the wounded ambitions of 100 families who traveled here expecting a crown, only to be told it was never truly available to them at all." The days following Alaric's declaration brought exactly the chaos Fenwick had warned against. Nearly a third of the visiting princesses departed within 48 hours, their carriages rolling angrily through the front gates, without ceremony or farewell, leaving behind cold formal letters from their fathers, expressing outrage at the perceived insult to their daughter's honor. Trade delegations that had arrived alongside the competition began quietly renegotiating terms, sensing weakness in a kingdom whose ruler had just demonstrated he could be swayed by matters of the heart over matters of state. Through it all, Princess Seraphine remained, watching the unfolding chaos with the same calculating patience she applied to every situation, though her reasons for staying had grown considerably more complicated than simple political ambition. She found Elira alone in the palace gardens one quiet afternoon, seated on a stone bench beneath a flowering tree, her expression carrying the exhausted weight of someone who had spent days fielding whispers, stares, and outright hostility from every corner of the court. "You look as though you have not slept in days," Seraphine observed, settling onto the bench beside her without invitation. "I have not," Elira admitted, too tired to maintain the careful deference she usually reserved for visiting royalty. "Forgive me, Your Highness, if I do not have the strength tonight to guard my words as carefully as I should." "Do not apologize," Seraphine said, surprising her. "I find I have grown tired of careful words myself these past days." She was quiet for a moment, studying the flowering branches overhead before continuing. "I came here expecting to become a queen, Elira. I will not pretend otherwise. But I have also spent enough time observing your king to understand that whatever exists between the two of you was never a passing distraction he might have set aside for the sake of politics." Elira looked at her, uncertain what to make of the unexpected honesty. "Why tell me this? You have every reason to resent me." "Perhaps I do," Seraphine admitted. "But I have also watched someone try to have you killed 3 times now, and I find I have little patience remaining for petty resentment when a genuine threat still walks free within these walls." She turned to face Elira fully, her expression uncharacteristically serious. "I did not come here to threaten you today. I came to warn you. Whoever is responsible for these attacks did not stop simply because the king made his declaration public. If anything, I suspect his honesty last night has only made you a more urgent target than before." The warning settled over Elira with cold, familiar dread. "You believe they will try again." "I believe," Seraphine said quietly, "that whoever wants you gone now understands they are running out of time before the king makes his choice permanent and unchangeable. Desperate people make desperate mistakes, Elira. I would advise you to remain vigilant, now more than ever." She rose from the bench, smoothing her skirts with practiced grace, before pausing to look back at Elira one final time. "For whatever it is worth, I hope you survive long enough to become the queen he so clearly intends you to be. This kingdom could use a ruler who was chosen for her heart rather than her crest." With that, she disappeared back toward the palace, leaving Elira alone beneath the flowering tree, Seraphine's warning echoing through her mind, alongside a fear she could no longer push aside. The king had declared his heart before the entire court, an act of courage that had thrown the kingdom into chaos and painted an even larger target across her back. And somewhere within the shadows of Silverfang, the person responsible for 3 separate attacks was, according to Seraphine's warning, growing more desperate by the day. The alarm bells rang out just after midnight, their frantic clanging tearing through the palace like a living thing. Alaric was on his feet, and moving before the 3rd toll had finished echoing off the stone walls, his sword already in hand, as he burst from his chambers to find Garrett sprinting down the corridor toward him, his face pale with an urgency that turned Alaric's blood to ice. "The royal wing," Garrett gasped. "Elira's chamber. The guards are down. She is gone." The words struck harder than any blade could have. Alaric did not remember the run through the corridors, did not remember the stairs he took 2 at a time, or the guards who scattered out of his path as he tore through the palace like a man possessed. He arrived at Alira's chamber to find both stationed guards unconscious on the floor, a struck window hanging open to the night beyond, and no trace of the woman who was meant to have been protected within those walls. "How?" Alaric demanded, his voice raw with a fury barely held in check. How did someone breach a guarded chamber in the royal wing without a single soul raising an alarm until it was too late? "A sedative," Garrett said grimly, kneeling beside one of the fallen guards and checking his pulse with visible relief when he found it steady. "Something in their water skins, likely. Whoever did this had access to the guards' supplies, which means someone within these walls helped them," Alaric finished, his voice cold with dawning fury. "Someone we trusted." A search of the chamber turned up a single item, left deliberately behind on the bed where Alira should have been sleeping. A folded piece of parchment, sealed with the same coiled serpent and flame crest that had marked the signet ring found weeks earlier. Alaric broke the seal with trembling hands and read the message within, his expression darkening with each word. "They want the crown," he said quietly, passing the letter to Garrett. "Not my death, not hers. They want me to abdicate, to name a successor of their choosing, or she does not survive the night." Garrett scanned the letter quickly, his jaw tightening. "This is not the work of a disgraced minor house acting alone, Your Majesty. This is someone with real ambition, someone who believes they have a legitimate claim to press if you were removed from the throne." Alaric's mind raced through the possibilities, through every noble family with distant blood ties to the crown, every disgraced lineage that might see an opportunity in the chaos of a king distracted by scandal and a competition thrown into disarray. And then, with sudden, terrible clarity, he remembered a conversation from weeks earlier, a careful warning delivered on a moonlit terrace by a princess who had seemed to understand the situation better than anyone else in the palace. "Seraphine," he said suddenly. Garrett looked up sharply. "You believe she is involved?" "No," Alaric said, already moving toward the door. "I believe she knows something. She warned Alira of exactly this danger, days before it happened. She has been watching this situation more closely than anyone else in this palace. If anyone has noticed something the rest of us have missed, it is her." They found Seraphine already awake, dressed and alert despite the late hour, as though she had been anticipating exactly this kind of urgent summons. She listened without interruption as Alaric explained what had happened, her expression growing increasingly grave with each detail. "House Draven," she said slowly, once he had finished. "I have heard that name before, though not in connection with the attacks against your maid. My father's court maintains careful records of every disgraced noble family across the neighboring kingdoms, information useful for identifying potential threats before they fully materialize." "What do you know?" Alaric demanded. "House Draven was disgraced decades ago," Seraphine explained. "But before their fall, they maintained close ties to a distant branch of Silverfang's own royal line, a cousin, several generations removed, who was passed over for succession when your grandfather claimed the throne. If that branch of the family still believes they hold a legitimate claim, and if they have spent years quietly rebuilding influence and resources while waiting for the right opportunity to press it, then a king, distracted by scandal, with no clear heir yet named, would represent exactly the kind of vulnerability such a family might choose to exploit." "A name," Alaric said urgently. "Give me a name, Seraphine." She hesitated only a moment before answering. "Lord Corwin Ashvale. He arrived among the visiting delegations weeks ago, claiming to represent minor trade interests from a neighboring territory. I noticed him because he asked an unusual number of questions about palace security during a dinner I attended early in the competition. Questions that seemed oddly specific for someone claiming only passing political interest in Silverfang's affairs." Garrett was already moving toward the door. "I will have him found immediately." "Wait." Alaric caught his arm. "If he suspects we have identified him, he may act against Alira before we can reach her. We need to know where he is holding her before we move against him directly." Lord Corwin Ashvale's guest chambers, when Garrett's guards finally located and searched them under cover of careful discretion, revealed exactly the confirmation they needed. Hidden beneath a false floorboard, they discovered documents outlining a distant claim to Silverfang's throne, correspondence detailing payments made to House Draven for the string of attacks carried out over recent weeks, and finally, a hastily scrawled note referencing an old hunting lodge beyond the palace's eastern boundary, abandoned for years and rarely visited by anyone within the current court. Alaric assembled a small, swift party within the hour, unwilling to risk a larger force that might alert Ashvale to their approach and endanger Illyra further. Garrett rode beside him, along with 4 of the palace's most trusted guards, moving through the darkness toward the distant tree line where the abandoned lodge waited, its outline barely visible against the starlit sky. They approached on foot for the final stretch, moving silently through the surrounding trees until the lodge came fully into view, a single lit window betraying the presence of whoever waited within. Garrett held up a hand, signaling the group to halt while he studied the building's layout, searching for the safest point of entry. Inside, unbeknownst to the rescue party creeping closer through the darkness, Illyra sat bound to a wooden chair in the lodge's main room, her wrists raw from struggling against the ropes, her heart pounding with a fear she refused to let show on her face. Lord Corwin Ashvale paced before her, his earlier polished courtly manner entirely stripped away to reveal the cold, calculating ambition beneath. "Your king has a choice to make," Ashvale said, more to himself than to her, as though rehearsing the demands he intended to deliver. Abdicate in favor of a legitimate claim, or watch the woman he so publicly declared his heart for die for his stubbornness. "He will not simply hand you a crown," Illyra said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And even if he did, do you truly believe the court, the guards, the entire kingdom would accept a stranger's claim built on kidnapping and threats?" "They will accept whatever proof of legitimate bloodline I present," Ashvale snapped, though something in his expression flickered with the first hint of doubt. "House Draven has waited generations for this opportunity. I will not let a servant's foolish courage undo decades of careful planning." Outside, Garrett gave the signal, and the small rescue party moved with practiced, silent precision, surrounding the lodge from multiple directions before Ashvale's single-hired guard, stationed lazily near the front entrance, even realized they had arrived. Alaric moved toward the rear entrance himself, sword drawn, his heart pounding with a fear far sharper than anything he had felt facing armed opponents in the training yard. The confrontation, when it finally came, was swift and chaotic. Ashvale's remaining hired guard fell quickly beneath Garrett's blade, disarmed rather than seriously harmed, while Alaric burst through the rear door, directly into the lodge's main room, sword raised, eyes immediately finding Illyra bound and frightened but very much alive in the chair before him. Ashvale spun toward the sudden intrusion, drawing a hidden blade from beneath his coat, but he was no match for a king trained since childhood in combat, and within moments, Alaric had disarmed him entirely, pressing his own sword to Ashvale's throat with barely restrained fury. "Give me one reason," Alaric said, his voice low and dangerous, "why I should not end this claim to my throne, here and now." "Because," Ashvale gasped, "killing me here, without trial, without proof presented before your council, would only strengthen the very claims you seek to destroy. My family has documentation, allies. If I die tonight without answers given publicly, others will simply take up where I left off, and you will spend the rest of your reign looking over your shoulder for the next challenger." Alaric's jaw tightened, torn between the fury demanding immediate justice and the cold, practical truth in Ashvale's words. It was Illyra's voice, hoarse but steady, that finally broke through the tension. "Alaric," she said softly, "let the law handle him. Do not let this night cost you anything more than it already has." Alaric held Ashvale's gaze a moment longer before lowering his sword, though the fury in his eyes remained undimmed. "Bind him," he ordered Garrett. "He will answer for his crimes before the full council, publicly, so that every remaining claim House Draven might raise dies alongside his credibility tonight." As the guards moved to secure Ashvale, Alaric crossed the room in 3 quick strides and knelt before Illyra, cutting through the ropes binding her wrists with careful, urgent hands. The moment she was free, she collapsed forward into his arms, and he held her tightly, his own hands trembling now that the immediate danger had passed, and the full weight of how close he had come to losing her finally settled over him. "I have you," he whispered into her hair. "I have you. You are safe now." "I knew you would come," Illyra murmured against his chest, her voice thick with exhausted relief. "I never doubted it, not for a moment." Outside the lodge, the first pale light of dawn began creeping over the eastern horizon, casting the surrounding trees in soft gold, as though the world itself understood that the darkest night Silverfang had endured in generations was finally, mercifully, drawing to its close. The council chamber had never held so many witnesses as it did the morning Lord Corwin Ashvale was brought before it in chains. Word of the kidnapping and rescue had spread through the palace within hours, and by the time the formal hearing began, nobles, remaining princesses, guards, and household staff alike crowded every available space along the chamber's walls, eager to witness the resolution of the danger that had gripped Silverfang for weeks. Illyra sat near the front of the assembly, still bearing faint marks along her wrists from the ropes that had bound her, though she held herself with a quiet composure that drew admiring glances from more than a few of the onlookers. Ashvale offered little resistance once the documentation seized from his chambers was presented before the full council, his carefully constructed claim to a legitimate bloodline crumbling beneath the weight of forged papers, coerced testimony from a captured House-Draven operative, and his own desperate attempt at kidnapping and extortion. Fenwick, who had spent the previous days verifying every detail with meticulous care, delivered the final judgment with grim satisfaction. "The claim is baseless," Fenwick announced to the assembled chamber, "constructed through decades of careful forgery and fueled by nothing more than bitter ambition. House-Draven's connection to the royal line was severed generations ago through legitimate succession, confirmed by records maintained in this very archive. Lord Ashvale's actions constitute treason against the crown, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit murder." The sentence, delivered swiftly by Alaric himself, exiled Ashvale from Silverfang's borders permanently, his lands and titles stripped, his remaining influence dismantled beyond any hope of future challenge. As guards led him from the chamber, his composure finally broke, and his furious protests echoed down the corridor, long after the heavy doors closed behind him, muffling his voice into distant, powerless silence. With the true threat finally exposed and neutralized, the palace exhaled a collective breath it had been holding for weeks. The remaining princesses, many of whom had grown genuinely fond of the drama and danger woven through their time at Silverfang, gathered in small groups throughout the following days, exchanging theories and gossip about the dramatic conclusion to a competition that had ended so differently than any of them had imagined. Princess Seraphine sought out Alaric privately before her own departure, finding him in the palace gardens, where he had taken to spending quiet mornings since Illyra's rescue, the weight of recent events still visible in the careful way he moved through each day. "I will be leaving within the hour," Seraphine said, settling onto the bench beside him without invitation, a habit he had come to find more amusing than presumptuous over their recent acquaintance. "My father will demand a full accounting of everything that transpired here, though I suspect he will be more relieved than disappointed once he understands the truth behind it all." "Thank you," Alaric said sincerely. "Without your warning, without the information you provided about Ashvale, I do not know how differently that night might have ended." "You would have found your way to her regardless," Seraphine said with a small, genuine smile. "I have rarely seen a man so thoroughly incapable of giving up on someone he loves. It is, I will admit, rather inspiring to witness, even from the losing side of a royal competition." "I am sorry," Alaric said quietly, "that this entire affair cost you, and so many others, so much, for a decision that was never truly in doubt from the beginning." "Do not apologize," Seraphine replied, rising gracefully from the bench. "I came here hoping to become a queen, Your Majesty, but I am leaving, having witnessed something far rarer than a crown. Guard it carefully. Not every kingdom is fortunate enough to have a ruler willing to risk everything for something as simple, and as difficult, as genuine love." She departed within the hour as promised, her carriage joining the steady stream of others, carrying the remaining princesses back toward their respective kingdoms. The grand competition that had once filled Silverfang's halls with 100 hopeful royals, finally drawing to its quiet, unremarkable close. 3 weeks later, Silverfang's great hall filled once more, though this time for an entirely different celebration. Every banner from the visiting kingdoms had been replaced with Silverfang's own silver and blue, and the crowd gathered within the hall's walls consisted not of competing princesses, but of nobles, common folk, and household staff alike, all invited to witness a coronation unlike any the kingdom had celebrated in generations. Illyra stood at the base of the dais, dressed not in the simple gray of a servant, but in a gown of pale silver silk that caught the light with every careful movement, her dark hair woven with delicate strands of silver thread. Odalis stood nearby among the assembled staff, tears of unabashed pride glistening in her eyes as she watched the young woman she had once assigned to laundry duty prepare to become the queen of an entire kingdom. Alaric descended from the dais to meet her personally, extending his hand as she climbed the steps beside him, the weight of the ceremonial crown resting in Fenwick's careful grip nearby, ready to be presented before the full assembly. "Are you certain," Alaric murmured quietly, for her ears alone, "that this is truly what you want? Once that crown is placed upon your head, there is no returning to the quiet life you once knew." Elira looked at him, at the man who had chased danger through darkened corridors and abandoned lodges, rather than let fear or politics stand between them, who had thrown aside 100 easier, safer choices for the sake of a servant who had once simply spoken to him honestly, rather than seeking his favor. "I have never wanted anything as certainly as I want this," she said softly. "Not the crown itself, but you. Whatever comes with standing beside you, I am ready to carry it." Fenwick stepped forward at Alaric's nod, lifting the crown carefully, as the entire hall fell into reverent silence. As it settled upon Elira's head, a cheer rose through the assembled crowd, common folk and nobles alike, celebrating not merely the coronation of a new queen, but the remarkable story that had brought her there, a tale that would be retold for generations across Silverfang's villages and halls alike. The maid who had once gathered broken dishes without complaint, now stood as queen beside the Alpha King who had chosen her, not for her title, not for her kingdom's alliances, but simply for the honest, steady heart that had drawn his attention, long before either of them understood where that quiet connection would eventually lead. Outside the great hall, the gardens bloomed beneath the warm afternoon sun, the danger and darkness that had once stalked Silverfang's corridors finally, completely dispelled. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of celebration carried across the palace grounds, a kingdom rejoicing not merely in tradition fulfilled, but in proof, rare and precious, that even a crown could be won, not through politics or birthright, but through a love brave enough to defy every expectation standing in its way. And as Alaric took Elira's hand before the entire kingdom, sealing their union with a promise neither danger nor doubt had ever managed to break, both of them understood that whatever challenges still lay ahead, they would face them exactly as they had faced everything else since that first fateful night in a storm-lit hallway. Together.